Morning. Well, actually, afternoon. It is Thursday, nearly the end of March, believe it or not. I want to do a quick video today about mesh networks, immutability, and Article 13. There's an interesting crossroads of things reaching to a maximum density before they kind of explode into multiple different destinations. And this morning I saw a tweet from Mesh NYC, which is a local kind of community driven collaborative group of people who get together, volunteer their time, and help deploy systems, mesh network systems around a location. And Mesh NYC is probably one of the biggest ones that I know of. There's probably bigger ones, but it's the one I know of. And I occasionally see their tweets come in my feed wall. And this morning they said that they've managed to get up to 295 nodes in their mesh network, which is a staggering achievement. Not just from the hours of time put into moving around the city, getting access to buildings, putting up the actual units, the devices, the mesh network aerials, all the cabling, all the signal adjustments, sitting on the laptop, getting it connected up to the other nodes. You know, just basic admin day by day, making sure that the network redundancy is there and it's running perfectly, and bottlenecks and bandwidth, and training people how to do this stuff. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of graft, especially when you're not a corporation. You're more of a 501c3, which is a non-profit in the United States. And you're kind of doing it because you believe in an idea, a set of ideals, which are not the common ideals. Oftentimes you get a lot of pushback with that, but I'm just staggered to see that these mesh networks are seeming to get a good foothold. And it makes me think that maybe a lot of the people in these corporations and big companies realize that there needs to be backup solutions, or there needs to be a way to distribute, and the distribute of the wealth here is bandwidth to people in low-income families, low-income areas, low-income communities, giving them decent backhaul, decent connectivity. Even from a perspective of somebody renting an apartment, it can take weeks and weeks and weeks to swap providers from one to another. We're not Sweden, where you can buy a brand new home and in the last 10 years you can go to WallSocket and select what data rate you want from 10 meg up to a gigabit. You know, even though we're in the developed world, there is strangleholds on bandwidth and certain regions. New York City, I think, is Times Warner. And every conference center I've ever been to in New York City has had like terrible access points and Wi-Fi connectivity. So it's an interesting thing for me is that I constantly follow along with that, because if I lived in a town or a city that was doing these volunteer mesh network projects, I would be taking part in something like that, because it gets me fired up about the idea of being able to go and source your own backhaul, going to ISPs, getting feeds into that network, looking after your own network, doing it from a community volunteer perspective, giving access to people to basic tools, people having access to get to blockchain programs and web platforms like Steem, to be able to share their world and be incentivized for the communities they join. I think it's almost like a basic right in some ways to have access to data and bandwidth, or it feels like that way to me now in the modern era that we live in. So there's kind of like a uniformity happening for me, is that we've got mesh networks. Article 13 is kind of pushing back against the bigger corporations, against kind of a link tax and various other bits in that documentation, which I've not dug into. I just know whenever I see anything like that on YouTube and other people start talking about it, chances are it's exploiting liberties somewhere. And so it got me thinking about the immutability of the Steem blockchain and how we can maybe utilize this, upwards trajectory, if you like, of mesh networks going everywhere and the blockchain. I mean, if we're getting access to buildings and we can put servers and witness nodes on those mesh networks, then we can kind of have localized networks. If there's 295 locations where these aerials are now, that's potentially 295 people, couples, families, businesses that are now part of a 300 strong community group of bandwidth users. And so layering on top of that the immutable blockchain and working together, sending funds between each other across this non-governed space, if you like. Obviously, Article 13 still is in effect when you're using the mesh network, because you're ultimately connecting out to the internet at some point through that big backhaul that they've tendered to like 10 different companies to get. But it's getting me thinking that maybe like the sustainability factor of solar power, wind power, going to a provider of a company that provides you with sustainable, environmentally friendly power usage, and then bolting together the Steem blockchain, the immutability part of that, the mesh network, self-governing, self-reliant, self-healing network of a mesh network, and the volunteerism of that, and building that up. So from 300 to 600 to 900, and just like ebbing that out further and further and further. But on a local level, imagine kind of like a non-global Steem. Maybe you could just fork the open source of the Steem and do this just purposely over mesh networks, make a lightweight version of it. Still have witnesses, but have the witnesses in a variety of different of these high-speed locations on the chain. And then do job exchange, value exchange between each one of the nodes. That's your point of presence for each one, right? You have a person or a group of people or a company that has asked for this mesh network to be put in place from this 501(c). And then you can donate and contribute towards the upkeep of that. So imagine having the Steem value economy in there, and everybody pays a little bit towards upvotes or delegation to that 501(c)(3 group of people, giving them upvotes on their posts, or when they go out and post images of their install or fixing a node network, then that money can be put back in to actually pay for bandwidth. Now, I think that's the biggest bottleneck with all of this, is that at some point the provider can switch off that feed, which means the 295 nodes wouldn't have the redundancy that they've got now with the mesh network. I mean, you could switch to different nodes in the network, but ultimately it's the backhaul. But if you were offline and you had environmentally friendly sourced power supplies that powered your local witness server, and you had a version of Steem running to those 300 people, those 300 nodes, that could be kind of interesting. So if you haven't looked into the mesh networking stuff, it's really, really taking off. I would love to see somebody do some kind of Steem or blockchain, any blockchain, on this mesh network, and what that would do for storytelling to help amplify the message of that 501(c) in terms of making the reach broader on it. I know they've done some amazing things with getting supernodes in there so they can take it to one side of the city to another, that activate in another area. But imagine this on a street by street basis. Imagine knowing from votes and upvotes and pictures and text, and I'm such and such, and we got our node, our mesh network connected this week. That the introduce yourself has a lot more value to it, because you're actually a part of the node network, giving passing data along to the next person. So it's almost like the two things for me are perfect: the immutability of the Steem blockchain and the upvoting and the value exchange, and then the data exchange of being a node in that mesh network. Something super powerful in that. So and it kind of moves away from us being concerned about legislation as such, because if we're using open source tools to create these mesh networks, we can make a mesh network just for our street or for our town or our little village, where people don't have to necessarily go onto the internet to get things done on a local level, shared resources on a local level. That's kind of exciting to me. All right, we need to go out and go to the shop because it's nice and warm. Have a great day. Have a look into mesh networks.
Drifting